Our second speaker is Dr. Notarius. Tanya lectures at the Rothberg International School of the Hebrew University. She's also the head of the MA program, the Near Eastern Languages, and lectures at Polis, the Jerusalem Institute of Languages and Humanities, and is also a rated research fellow at the Department of Hebrew at the University of the Free State in Bloemfontein in South Africa. She's the author of the monograph, The Verb in Archaic Biblical Poetry, and of dozens of articles on the linguistics of Biblical Hebrew, Ugaritic, and Aramaic. Tanya, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. Let me share my presentation. I hope I won't have internet issues. It wasn't so stable at my place. Everyone can see my presentation?
Yes, it's fine.
Yes, okay, thank you. First of all, I want to thank Nili for inviting me, for having me here. The name of this event is Issues in Late Biblical Hebrew and Beyond. So I guess that's me who come from beyond, because I am going to talk about some other things as well, and namely about expressions of passive voice in Ugaritic and Biblical Hebrew in the view of historical linguistic perspective. Just a second, it doesn't move forward, my presentation. Oops. I don't know why it doesn't progress. Let me unshare it and share it again. Okay, I will work it this way. So the work is based on my current project connected to syntax of Ugaritic and some publications that are connected to this. And just a second. And the study of Ugaritic morphosyntax faces many challenges, like lack of full localization and also the differences between different genres of Ugaritic writing. That's why, in my perspective, it's so important to be based on comparative analysis with other Semitic languages, for example, with Hebrew in particular. And in general, this paper has an approach that Ugaritic and Hebrew systems can be viewed as part of the same historical linguistic continuum. And I will try to illustrate it with a case study that I included in this paper. No, I can't move forward. Just a second, something is happening with my mouse. Oh. Why?
Tanya, you have to put the mouse on the slides themselves to the left.
I know, but I don't know, it doesn't move forward. I don't know why. Just a second, let me unshare it once again. Yes, sorry. So some formal marking of G passive. In Ugaritic, G passive in Ugaritic is maybe the main marking of passive voice, and it is marked by vocalization in some cases, or by case on the passiative subject, or by the concord between the subject and the verbal form in passive. The G passive forms in Ugaritic also have some semantic and pragmatic markings, some exclusive factors. As for example, G passive clauses, they don't have agent phrases, don't use agent phrases, but quite often imply an agent in the context. For example, in the example here, Muhatsa Akhat, so Akhat was killed by whom? By Anat, and this is quite clear out of the context. And also the passiative subject is commonly topicalized, put in the frontal position. As for example, in this example, Arabu yutanu and yatsau la yutanu, as I illustrate here. G passive verbs will be also used as impersonal subjectless passives, as I will show further on. In general, I summarize my findings, and out of 27 relatively certain cases of G passive attested in 22 roots, the distribution in corpus is as follows: 29 cases appear in poetry and 28 cases in prose. 43 cases are prefix conjugation, in 14 cases are suffix conjugation. So basically this distribution corresponds to the general distribution of these categories in the corpus. And I didn't track any difference between the language of prose and the language of poetry as far as the usage of GP passive is concerned. It is equally productive in all parts of the Ugaritic corpus. The end stem also has some, the Niphal end stem also have some characteristic formal marking, as for example, it has in syllabic writing, and it has prefix in suffix conjugation and gemination sometimes of some consonants in prefix conjugation, and also some vowels can be distinctive. As far as the function of end stem in Ugaritic is concerned, it is used mainly for middle voice. Thus, in contrast to G passive, the end stem verbs are commonly derived from stative verbs and from intransitive verbs for inquisitive or resultative meaning, as ara, to be awake, and nara, woke up, and also from the verbs of change and motion, and always to feature a passiative subject. Otherwise, end stem is derived from dynamic and transitive verbs for anticausative, as nasaka, to pour or to spill, and yanasaki, to flow, and also in reciprocal meaning. So the end stem in Ugaritic is attested in passive or medio-passive usage, as for example, hata'a, nachta'u, the word crushed. Summarizing, I can present the numbers here. I studied something like 31 quite stable cases of end stem, 61, excuse me. 34 of them are in the prose, and 27 are in poetry. So the scope of prose is a little bit higher. 35 cases are prefix conjugation, and 26 cases are suffix conjugation. So again, the number of suffix conjugation is relatively high. And out of these 26 cases, 22 are attested in prose, so 84%. The distribution of semantic usages is as follows. The middle voice usages are equally distributed in different corpus types, but out of 17 cases of the medio-passive Niphal verbs, 14 cases, actually 92%, are in prosaic language. So in prose, there are definitely explicitly more cases of the end stem, particularly of suffix conjugation, and its passive usage is predominantly prosaic, which of course remind us about Canaanite languages, and therefore the comparison to Hebrew will make sense in this context. Basically, we can notice that there is a lot of in common between Ugaritic and Biblical Hebrew as far as the overlap between the Kal passive and Niphal passive usages is concerned. And indeed, the shift from Kal passive to Niphal is a well-known chapter in the historical linguistics of Biblical Hebrew. It is quite productively used in the book by Handel and Houston, and summarizing, they notify that the forms of Kal passive are commonly revocalized as tual and Niphal, as for example, yulad ben, and that many Niphal prefix conjugation forms are perhaps indeed reanalyzed Kal passive forms, and they discuss the case of Trev, yivaldu, which in Ktiv is perhaps va yuldu in Kal passive, And also, of course, the fact that Kal passive disappears almost completely from late biblical Hebrew, and the contrast pairs like Vatukach and Vatikach are good examples of such development. So what about an stem, how it is distributed between the middle voice and passive voice semantics in biblical Hebrew? Actually, I don't have exact statistical analysis. I'm based on the research that was done by others, and it looks like the results are still preliminary. But still, some preliminary calculation point to at least 50% of the Niphal cases in biblical Hebrew used as passive, distributed in different textual layers and genres. So the dissertation of Klein talks about 50% of Niphal usages as passive, and the book of Sebesma writes that out of 428 roots containing Niphal forms, more than 770 roots may be translated passively. So comparing to this 50%, in Ugaritic, as I said, out of 61 cases of the and stem, 17 cases, 28% have passive or major passive meaning. So maybe in this context, one can mention, take a look, what is the proportion between the number of G passive verb, the roots that derive G passive, comparing to the general number of roots in the language at all in general. So in Ugaritic, the proportion is that 22 roots derive G passive out of 531 roots, so approximately 4% of roots derive G passive, while in Hebrew, again, numbers here may be a little bit shaky. So usually in research, they talk minimally about 50 roots that derived G passive out of the general number of 1,552 roots. That's according to some calculation that I got from Christian. So a little bit mean less 3% of the roots derive G passive in this language. Another interesting story is, of course, the verbs, namely the roots that derive both verbs, derive verbs in G passive and derive verbs in and stem. So this overlap is attested not only in Hebrew, but also in Aram, in Ugaritic. So in Ugaritic, I found 4 roots that derive both G passive and stem. So 3 roots derive these verbs in passive diatheses, like lakacha, take, yatana, give, and mahia, clear. And 1 verb like nasaka perhaps has a middle and stem and passive G passive stem. So 4 roots altogether of 22 roots that derive G passive, so about 18%. While in biblical Hebrew, there are 32 roots that derive both G passive and Niphal. Even if one excludes verbs that have Niphal only in the prefix conjugation, so some don't know what to do with such verbs, there are 21 roots of altogether 50 roots that derive both G passive and Niphal. So the number is between 24 to 42%. Also, we have here these roots like lakach and natan as in Aram, as in Ugaritic, but other roots as well. So in conclusion, the G passive and Niphal in the same stem in Ugaritic and in Hebrew show a little bit different picture. In Ugaritic, in biblical Hebrew, the functional overlap between the Kal passive and Niphal stems is much more widespread, and the Kal passive usage is more marginalized. So in around 34%, a bit less, of the Kal passive verbs are being replaced by the Niphal verbs. While in Ugaritic, the position of G passive stem is much more stable and unchallenged. Only 12% of G passive verbs have an and stem replacement, mainly in the language of prose. One more usage that, in my view, is very illustrative it is a so-called impersonal or subjectless passive. So impersonal passive arises when the agent is eliminated from the subject position without promoting patient to this subject position. And that's actually the core of what passive deitasis is doing. So in Ugaritic, as I mentioned, there are impersonal subjectless passives. At least I have could spot several cases, and only G passive is used in this function, used impersonally, like la yurdama, lo yurdam, let it not be told, and loaka, it was sent to him, and some other cases, while the and stem verbs that are primary middle voice expression are never used impersonally, and they always assign patient as their syntactic subject. So in biblical Hebrew, the situation is very different. Here I want again refer to this very important study of biblical Hebrew historical linguistics by Handel and Jostam. So they discussed this case, which I mentioned already, from Qumran scroll, and there the change is vayivaled, to singular from vayivaldu banim. They change vayivaled, and the command is it is singular rather than plural, which reflects the impersonal construction, uninteresting for our purpose. So in my view, this is, on the contrary, quite interesting for the purpose of historical linguistic phenomena, because it's actually this impersonal passive construction that illustrates certain development. And in biblical Hebrew, the distribution is as follows. About 10 cases of impersonal kind passive uses are attested, like lo zuna, yutan et haaretz hazot, and so on. And about 28 cases of impersonal Niphal uses are attested, mostly in passive, in the prefix conjugation, but also in suffix conjugation, by, like v'yisa bam et hashulchan, v'neisaf simcha vagil, and so on. So summarizing the personal, so-called non-promotional passive usage, I can conclude that the impersonal passive is intrinsically typical for the passive voice. In my view, impersonal passive is actually the core of passive function in the language, the demotion of subject, agentive subject from its position. And it is expressed by the G passive in Ugaritic. The middle voice, like the Ugaritic end stem, which primarily aims at the patientive subject promotion, is not used in such a construction. On the contrary, in biblical Hebrew, both Kal passive and Niphal have passive voice properties and therefore can be used as impersonal passives. And now a few words about a little bit about late biblical Hebrew and Qumran Hebrew to show how the data that I have presented so far can be connected with further perspective. So a late biblical Hebrew corpus, excluding the poetic corpus, of course, the book of Job or the book of Proverbs, virtually shows almost no attestation of Kal passive. So there are two cases of uklu in Nehemiah in the same chapter, and there is Yulad in First Chronicles, which is also parallel in Genesis, most probably. So Raimon, in his research on this issue, points to the fact that in the Dead Sea biblical scrolls, some Kal passive forms are altered into Niphal, passive participles, or active constructions, although there is a considerable number of unaltered cases. I don't have right now exact statistics, but I will have it for publication. In the Dead Sea non-biblical scrolls, as he writes, one finds a handful of examples of these types of forms, up to 5 certain cases, in addition to several more ambiguous cases as Vanitzar, Lokachti, and Kutsar, and so on. Although for him, these forms are rather construed as true puals and hufals, and he refers to the work of Fasberg, where it is shown that if PL, if Kal shifts to PL, then most probably Kal passive forms are naturally reanalyzed as a pual. But in my view, still this tendency, which contrasts between Qumran Hebrew and late biblical Hebrew, shows that we can deal with these forms as with an expression of the conservative tendency of Qumran Hebrew of reversing the linguistic change, or bringing it back, so to say, and by emulating the classical stylistic models, the tendency that has been mentioned already in research and also in the framework of this workshop in the talk of Edward Cook. This question was raised. So just my conclusion, what I try to illustrate with this study is that Ugaritic and Hebrew data can and actually should be represented as part of the same historical linguistic continuum. The and stem verbs launched the passive voice usage in the language of Ugaritic prose, extending it further to more verbal lexemes, as illustrated in classical biblical Hebrew corpus, and also acquiring impersonal passive usage, so that the G passive stem practically disappears already at the stage of late biblical Hebrew, with sporadic reversal of this development in Qumran Hebrew. So basically, I have mentioned several topics which in my view can be further developed, and the comparison or other kind of combined study of Ugaritic in biblical Hebrew syntax can bring many fruits, as for example, the use of stative verbs and Niphal as the kind of passive participle that is slightly attested in Ugaritic, and then give a lot of historical development as derived passive participle, as the usage of agent phrases, and some other things connected to passive voice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tanya. Can you, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great. The floor is open to questions and comments. Please, if you want to send me a chat. That's all okay also. Drew Longacre, please.
Yes, thank you, Tanya. That was very interesting. I didn't quite catch it with the biblical Hebrew one, the roots, where you have both the call passive and the Niphal forms. How exactly would you explain why you have the two? Is there a diachronic dimension, functional, semantic, or are they truly interchangeable?
I myself personally didn't check every single case, but I checked several verbs, and I'm based on the research that mainly says that they have almost the same function, kal passive and Niphal within the same roots. They're basically used for passive voice. Again, maybe if I start to check every single case, perhaps I will do it, I will find some distinctions, as perhaps some Niphal verbs will be more middle voice expressions, while kal passive will be more passive voice expressions. But on the surface, the impression is that they are used interchangeably. Of course, there is distribution between books. For example, the book of Genesis prefers G passive, and the book of Samuel prefers Niphal. There is certain distribution between corpus, about which I can't tell you so many wise things. For example, Handel and Joosten write that G passive is more common in Yahvistic corpus, while Niphal is more common in P, in priest source, and so on. So there should be some distribution. But basically, I believe, yes, it shows the certain stage in the development by which these forms are being replaced by another expression.
Okay, I'm going to ask Hanan. He raised his hand before Noam and Ron. Hanan, do you want to ask your question, or?
Yes,
okay.
A very little question. You showed that the root Yud Pei Ayin appears in Ugaritic in Niphal, and in biblical Hebrew, it appears in Hifil. Can you say something about it?
Yeah, in Ugaritic, it appears in Kal and in Niphal, if I'm not mistaken. I don't think it appears in positive. I don't have the dictionary in front of me, So it appears in kal for a kind of inner causative action to appear, yeah, I don't remember right now, but it has the same function that can be expressed by causative binyan as well. And in Niphal, it has the middle voice, yeah, middle voice meaning. I have to check in the dictionary to be sure. No causative binyan. Sorry.
Okay. Noam, and then Ron.
Thank you very much, Tanya, for a very detailed presentation. Just a small comment. I didn't manage to catch up all your examples in slide, I think, 21. But I did notice that for the Qumran Hebrew material, I think that most of the examples were from the Hodayot scroll. And I think this may not be incidental because the Hodayot is a poetic text, first and foremost, yes. And very heavily indebted to biblical poetic diction. So it might be worthwhile to check. Perhaps yes. These cases actually depend directly on particular passages. Rather than reflecting an entirely independent usage of these forms, whether the Niphals or Puals.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Actually, I just took these cases directly from the paper of Raymond, and I didn't check them. I will check them. And I don't think this is entirely independent usage. It's definitely kind of stylistically marked usage, stylistic device. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
Okay, there's a question now from 50% of Hendel and Joosten. Ron, go ahead.
Good. Well, I thank you for that wonderful, very rich paper. I now want to officially say that the impersonal passive usage is very interesting. And I think you made a wonderful case for that being the pivot that started the merger of the Niphal and the kal passive. So are you confident that is that an innovation in Ugaritic? Is that the sort of thing that we don't find in, you know, Akkadian and things like that? Because I think it's a wonderful proposal.
Yes, it's a very interesting, indeed very interesting case. And the paper about G passive will appear this year in Journal for Semantics by paper. Long paper about G passive in Ugaritic. So all the cases are discussed there in many details. So I think that to a certain extent, I collected all the cases which they are not, the category is not mentioned in grammar books like Tropper and so on. This category of impersonal passive doesn't exist in grammar books. Although in some of the translations, Tropper does show that it is impersonal, but he doesn't collect the cases as a separate category. So I think that's interesting to show that it is still a separate category. And in my paper, I compare mainly to Arabic and Hebrew. So about Akkadian, the situation is complicated because Qumran writes there is no impersonal passive in Akkadian. But Hasselbach writes there is impersonal passive in Akkadian and brings some example. So I quote both meanings. So, but it is less typical for Akkadian, for sure.
Great, thank you.
Okay, there's about 55 seconds for any other question before we move on to the third speaker. I don't see any questions on the chat, in which case, Tanya, on behalf of all of us, thank you very much for an excellent paper.
Thank you.